Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Minister, for joining us today. My first question speaks to the opposition we're hearing from Yukon First Nations. It's been made clear that they are opposed to the amendments made by Bill S-6 to YESA because, in their own words, quote, they undermine our Aboriginal rights, titles, and interests. I'd like to quote the Grand Chief, Ruth Massey, who said, quote, this whole process attacks the integrity of our constitutionally protected agreements, and Yukon First Nations will stand by their agreements even if it means going to court. They give us no choice. We did not sign our agreements to implement them in the courts, but we will protect them, end of quote. My question to you, Mr. Minister, is how is it that you are prepared to push forward a bill that does not have the consent of Yukon First Nations? Passing the bill violates their final agreement. And why is this government willing to pass legislation that undermines the constitutionally protected agreement and send Canada into litigation against First Nations?
Well, from the get-go, I will tell you that if S-6 did what you allege or what the Chief Ruth Massey alleges, it would not be before the House, because it is important that we abide by the law of the land in the area in question, and this is doing it. The interpretation given to this bill by Chief Massey is not in line at all with the very articles of the umbrella agreement. I mean, on each and every count where it is alleged that this violates the umbrella agreement, and I've met personally with the chief, and she could not show me one single example, concrete example of how the S-6 violated the umbrella agreement. So I urge you to look at the umbrella agreement, the provisions of the bill, and you will see that they are perfectly consistent.
Well, thank you, Mr. Minister. I do want to note that it's actually Grand Chief Ruth Massey, and she speaks out on behalf of Yukon First Nations, and we certainly look forward to hearing from her next week, because I think we'd hear a different story from her directly than what we've heard from your response. Mr. Minister, what's come up time and time again is that yes, a number of the proposals in S-6 emanate from the 5-year review of YESA, but we know that there are 4 amendments here that were not mentioned in the 5-year review. They have come as a surprise to many Yukoners. So my question is, could you expand for the committee what the source was of these 4 amendments that did not appear in the YESA 5-year review? Who identified these amendments?
These amendments have been identified by officials, by stakeholders, by the government of Yukon, and they have also been informed by other similar provisions currently existing within the legislative framework of laws that apply in the Yukon and or other territories in the north. So these further amendments, which were not discussed, you're right, during the 5-year review process, were, however, brought forth to the attention of the Council of First Nations and the First Nations. They were consulted on all of these, and at the end of that process, we took into account some of the comments that we received and acted accordingly. But that is the source. The idea here is to improve the process so that all of Yukoners, including First Nations, do benefit in terms of improvement to the socioeconomic status of all Yukoners, and also to improve the process.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. If one of the meetings you're referring to is the meeting on February 26th, we're very concerned to know that Canada arrived at that meeting and provided paper copies of the amendments that were being proposed and refused to provide electronic versions to the First Nations that were at this meeting by phone. This clearly stopped these First Nations from being able to participate in a meaningful way, and I certainly believe that this is it's simply not right to be able to say that First Nations were consulted properly in doing so. Given that these 4 amendments were not agreed upon, and I certainly would like to hear who exactly these stakeholders were. You did point out the government of the Yukon is one of the parties that perhaps even proposed these amendments. We're not sure. I'm wondering if you could clarify who these stakeholders were. I know there's been reference to industry being supportive. However, we've heard from important industry stakeholders who have expressed real interest about the destabilization that this bill will create. So who are these stakeholders? Was it the government of the Yukon that proposed these amendments in the first place? And finally, don't you think, given the major opposition to these 4 amendments that First Nations oppose, that a majority of Yukoners oppose, wouldn't it be best if those amendments were removed and we went back to the table in terms of consultation and proper consultation with First Nations rather than trying to ram them through?
Okay, regarding your first alleged refusal to provide an electronic copy, you know the rules of the House better than I, and at that occasion it was the bill, and the bill cannot be disclosed before it is provided to Parliament in the House of Commons or in the Senate. So that's the reason for that. The second part of your question as to the stakeholders, the government of the Yukon did make a specific proposal for these amendments, and so did our own department officials concerned about ensuring that Yukoners were not left behind in the quest for economic development and improving their status. The government had already proceeded with the changes to the Nunavut and Northwest Territories regulatory regime, and it is important for all Northerners, wherever they are in the North, that they benefit from the same legislative framework that can promote investment, that can bring certainty, and ensure the proper development and protection of the environment in the North. And these are the reasons why it is deemed by this government that those amendments are necessary to achieve that purpose.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ashton.